You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we're joined by Robyn Steward, who is an autism trainer with over 15 years of experience, specializing in practical strategies for supporting autistic individuals. She has worked globally, delivering training and consultancy to organizations, media, and local authorities. As a mentor to autistic people and a published author with Jessica Kingsley Publishers, Robyn focuses on safety and social challenges, particularly for autistic women. Her work aims to improve understanding and create inclusive environments for autistic individuals worldwide. Welcome to the podcast, Robyn Steward.
Hiya, thanks for having me.
Well, I appreciate you coming on and giving us this perspective and helping to educate the audience on some of the issues that are unique to autistic women. But before we go and get deep into the subject, I'd be very curious to understand what sparked your interest in the field of autism and the experiences of autistic individuals.
Well, when I was 17, I was in a further education college, which is it's not the same as university. It's a choice you can take after high school, before university, or you can use it to get into industry. And I was in a support group for fellow autistic students, and we were all having those similar problems. So, obviously I can't speak for the other members of the group, but me personally, the teachers would say that I brought bullying on myself, and they, the non-educated about autism teachers were not very helpful and supportive. And then as a group, we got the opportunity to deliver some autism training, and that kind of came from me, because we were all kind of having similar issues. And then they said, oh, let's get some training in. And I said, well, why don't we do the training? So a group of us, or the three of us, started delivering autism training. And one student was going to talk about their experience of being in special school, so a segregated school essentially for children with, in the UK we say SEND, special educational needs and disabilities. And then another student was going to talk about their experience going into college, like the sensory experience. And then I thought that somebody should explain what autism is, which meant that I started researching what autism was, because I was just an autistic person and I'd read Freaks, Geeks and Asperger's syndrome, but I didn't really know a lot about autism. And then while I was reading, I discovered about theory of mind, and I was like, oh, that's it. That's why I don't understand non-autistic people, and that's maybe also why they don't really understand me. And it seemed to me like, sometimes I think sometimes I think in the autism community, it seems like some people sort of have this divide of like, oh, either neurotypical people are all good or all bad, or autistic people are all good or all bad, but everybody's obviously different. And to me, it seemed like the way to make any change happen is for both groups to work together and to find a way of sort of meeting in the middle, rather than it being about one group's way of thinking is the right way, because it's very clear that we've got all these different groups and it seems like autism is naturally occurring. So, it's not like, it's not a choice thing. So it'd be better if we just learn to understand each other. So that's why I became passionate about teaching people about autism. And then as I, became, I suppose, got onto the autism speaking circuit, I could see that mainly, theory of mind was being talked about in like a negative way, as being, oh yeah, autistic people, they don't have theory of mind, and that means, they don't care. And it's like, empathy and theory of mind are two different things. It seems like theory of mind is one of the skills you need towards empathy, but I think, I'm not an academic in the subject, but I don't know, my gut was telling me that there was more to empathy than just theory of mind, and that theory of mind is a skill that you can learn, and that demonizing people who struggle with theory of mind isn't helping anybody. Like, to me, those things just seem very logical, and I'm not trying to convince anybody. I'm just saying that was my standpoint. And so I started just working in autism as a trainer, and then later as a mentor, and then I was invited to write a book. And I think it's important to remember that this book was written in 2012, and in 2012, you know, it was still news to lots of people that women and girls could be autistic, and there could be, you know, different ways of presenting. I think now in 2024, you know, that's a really like long time ago, really. Like a lot's moved on since then, and I think that one of the things that has moved on is how we talk about gender. Now it's really common to meet people who have they them pronouns or who identify as non-binary, and I think in the general sort of public awareness is the idea of the gender spectrum. And I think that we probably should start talking about autism in a more sophisticated way. That, yeah, in 2012, it was so important that we flagged that women and girls can be autistic, because that's true, that women and girls can be autistic. But what's also true is that somebody might get missed as being autistic if they don't have a presentation that people align with a particular gender that person isn't. So if you're a boy and you happen to be very good at masking, you might not get an autism diagnosis, because people might not pick that up, because they're like, oh, well, girls are good at masking. If a boy's good at masking, he's not autistic. And that's obviously rubbish, because you can be a boy and be good at masking and be autistic, just as you can with any gender. So I think that it speaks of its time in terms of the first book's title, and the focus, because I did want to write something about gender, because there was this conversation around that time and it did seem important. But I am a cis woman, so obviously I'm coming from that perspective, and I'm gender non-conforming, I guess, in that I'm quite masc in the way that I present myself. But I don't think that I can understand why Jessica Kingsley Publishers wouldn't want a book about gender identity written by a cis woman. I mean, maybe they would, but like, to me, it made sense that they sort of guided me in this direction. But also that I think that people were like, what I was hearing and what I was seeing as a mentor was that autistic people were often, it did seem to be, I mean, obviously boys and men can be victims of sexual violence, and I don't know the statistics of that, but what I can tell you is that there's quite a high statistical level of women and girls.
I definitely appreciate the fact that this started from you and two other peers who were saying, hey, you know what, we need to start exploring the education of others to be able to share experiences, because being able to make decisions, being able to understand someone else's perspective, is that you have to have that shared experience, or else we're making assumptions, and that creates the problems. Similar to what you were saying with being able to even diagnose or to be able to help support somebody effectively. If your assumption is that somebody is male in how they identify, well, then you might be missing out on some presenting characteristics. But that's the same for all of these subjects, is that having this open dialogue will help us to explore and learn more on how to be able to work well with everybody in this relationship, and to kind of become that partnership, versus having any sort of, I don't know, differing of scales where I see you as something different than me, or something better or worse than me. It levels the playing field having these conversations. But we were talking about some of these presentations that exist that are typically identified as female traits, women traits, and some of these might be ones that should be addressed earlier in life, or we should be prioritizing more. What are some of the common safety and social challenges that you're seeing for autistic women across different age groups right now?
I think that it's important to remember the whole context of a person's life. And I think sometimes there can be this focus on changing the autistic person. And I'm not saying, or changing the autistic person's behavior. And I'm not saying that that's not always something that is needed. But I think sometimes that you might have a parent who's autistic, doesn't realize that they're autistic, and thinks that this is the way they think is how everybody else thinks. But equally, you might also have a parent who's so worried that their child fits in that they are teaching their child to mask. And although I do think that masking is on a scale, and I think that possibly non-autistic people sometimes do a little bit of masking. I think masking becomes unhealthy when you're doing it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you're putting so much energy and time into it that you are like not projecting yourself. But I think an example of this is when I go into schools, high schools particularly, and when I'm talking to a group of children who are like 13, 14 plus, up until about up until sixth form, so 16, 17, that middle group between 13 and 16, when you ask, does anyone have any questions, often no one puts their hand up. Before that age and after that age, people put their hand up. And when I've talked to teachers about it, they're like, well, the kids don't want to stand out in any way.
Mm.
So in a way, that is masking, but it's very, I guess that one might describe it as low-level masking, but like that is possibly not having a hugely detrimental effect to those young people, because basically they're masking. It's just, I'm not going to ask questions in front of all my peers in a school assembly. But it's like when it's, oh, I'm not going to speak up for myself when someone's asking if I want to have something to eat, or if I want a hug, or X, Y, and Z, you know, that's when it becomes a problem. So I do think that there's, you know, some parents, they might really want their child to fit in and just sort of go under the radar so they don't get bullied. And it's with the best intentions, but it's actually very detrimental to the autistic person if they're masking so much that they can't be themselves, and they're putting all this energy in and effort into it because they're not being able to focus on the things they're really good at. But what about all the other stuff? Because I've met lots of autistic people who have PhDs and can't get a job. You know, like it
No,
really
absolutely.
doesn't matter. Yeah, it doesn't matter how well qualified you are.
Mhm.
What matters is that you have the skills to be able to navigate adult life. The same with, you know, it's great if you can do quadratic equations, but if you can't manage your bank account and pay your rent on time, then you're not going to be able to manage through adult life. So I do think that sometimes gifted children in particular, they get sort of almost like funneled through the education system.
What we started out with being able to say that the person that's guiding the decision making, the person that's guiding, you know, what it is that I feel like I need to be empowered with, should be the autistic individual in every one of these stories that you're telling. It's like we need to turn back to them and figure out what is it that you feel like is missing from your life that you want to work on. Similar that you'd be asking me is, hey, Jeff, like what is it that you want to become better at? What is it that's missing in your particular repertoire skills that's going to enhance your life? And I think that those questions and those concerns needs to be a conversation. It needs to be collaborative in order for the autistic individual to have a voice in determining what and where their life goes. But the masking question, I think, is a really good one. Whether it's learned, socialized, or whether masking is done for that cause of insecurity or safety, it creates other problems. It creates barriers. And the first one that comes to my mind is the safety issue. If you've been told your whole life you need to conform, you need to do what other people want you to do in order to make others happy, you need to respond in very specific ways or else you're wrong. That seems very dangerous to me. Are these some of the concerns that you would be bringing up?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think you're sort of alluding to coercive control. Definitely, that's, I think, definitely like an issue that a lot of autistic people could fall into. And I think that it's often very subtle and builds up over time. And also, if a young, particularly young people, I mean, this could affect someone of any age, but I think maybe you're more vulnerable when you're younger because you have less life experience. But if you are somebody who has been bullied a lot and been isolated, then if somebody shows interest in you in any way, then you're going to go towards it. That does make, like evolutionary sense, like because humans are wired to go towards people of a similar ways of thinking and doing things. Excuse me. If people show an interest in us, what if even if it's just like I'm drawing a picture and somebody else likes art and they come over and they're like, oh, I see you drawing a picture, that's a nice picture, and like they're just drawn to me because they like draw, and I'm like, oh, do you want to share my pens with me, so if you have lots of very negative social experiences, then any positive social experiences is going to be amplified. It's kind of like if you only ever have chocolate ice cream once a year, then every time you have chocolate ice cream, it's going to be amazing. So if you imagine being an autistic person who constantly gets, like, because even if it's subtle, like negativity socially, like even if it's just someone's like not wanting to just stop and have a conversation with the person, or doesn't shoo them away exactly, but just kind of like doesn't really, it's busy and, and like if that's your only or your majority of experience socially, anyone showing any interest becomes, like, oh, well, this is great because that's like your chocolate ice cream moment. And so if a predator, well, predators look for people who are easy prey. So the more isolated you are, the better prey you are, because you're easier to manipulate, because the predator doesn't have to manipulate those around you, they just have to manipulate you. And if they're giving you lots of positive reinforcement, and if you've been through a school system that has been based on positive reinforcement, then that also makes you vulnerable. Because in a way you've got to kind of be able to also have internal reinforcement of things that are worthwhile, and not just, be like in a hierarchical system where you're waiting for people to praise you, and the only time you ever get any sort of positive reinforcement is just from those above you in a social hierarchy, which you may not even have awareness that exists, because social hierarchies in the, the like unwritten curriculum, like autistic people often need to be educated on those kinds of things, like the social hierarchy exists and why it exists and how it exists. But also I've met lots of young autistic people who don't see themselves as a different age to the people that support them, like their teachers and TAs and things. I know that, like for a child that has an average or above average IQ, you'd think, well, they know that the teacher's older than them. Yeah, they know that, but the teacher is the only person in the school possibly who gives them any kind of mutual respect. If they're not getting that from their peers, then they're right at the bottom of the peer social hierarchy. So they're almost like not involved in that social hierarchy. And so there's just the teacher, and in their head, it's like, well, the teacher is like the same as me. And I know that confused me as a young person, but also I have seen that confusion amongst other autistic people. I think around puberty, I think it's really important that we are very open about these conversations. And if you're a parent and it feels awkward, that you have a space to voice that and that you can work through it.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's working on things that you personally need to work on. It's these things that you're discussing aren't necessarily if my child is neurodiverse or neurotypical. I mean, these are conversations that a parent has to work through on their own, but it becomes that much more important for somebody who might have some barriers to being able to socially understand different concepts, or relationships are a barrier, or something to that effect, where they need additional education or additional support, or to be taught in a different way than what would be the typical process. This sounds like a shared responsibility. I mean, whether it's social or whether it's educational or whether it's clinical or whatever process we're talking about, it shouldn't be a hierarchy. It should be a combination of I'm learning from you at the same time that you're learning from me, and we're working together to be able to build on what's important for the individual. When you were talking about a lot of these issues, I want to go back to the concept of masking one last time, because masking creates the vulnerabilities that you discussed. And it puts somebody in a place where, they're trying to conform or they don't understand. Nobody's helping them to address, and they're just trying to be like everybody else. But there's got to be that other end where if I'm masking all the time, my sense of self could lead to other mental health disorders. If I don't value my own thoughts, my own feelings, my own opinions, I would imagine that depression would be something that would be very common. Is that the other end of masking? Is that, not only do you sometimes create vulnerabilities, but you're also devaluing yourself and you're susceptible to other mental health conditions.
Yeah, I would say that's true. I don't have any research that I can back that up as my opinion, but my opinion is yes, I would have thought. I know that masking has a negative impact on mental health, and depression, as you say, seems like logically that's how you would possibly experience, how you would feel if you were being devalued, if you were being told continually, no, the way you think is wrong, you've got to try and pretend that you think in this other way and act in this other way. I think also anxiety is very common, and like my first response is always you got to unpick the issue, because it could be sensory, it could be like executive dysfunction, like there's so many things, and understanding where that person's coming from and why they might be having that difficulty is like the first thing to do. So it's going to vary person to person, I suppose is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and it goes back to the idea of shared responsibility. I think in all of this, it's, the person who is neurotypical in the situation that you're describing needs to have a better understanding that somebody might be experiencing the world that's an experience different than what they have right now. They might have a perspective of what's happening or perception of what's occurring that might be different than their view. And on the flip side, like you said, it's like, when in the story, when you were engaging in a behavior that was maybe intensifying somebody's response, it's knowing, okay, well, this is what my response might be causing somebody else. So I need to maybe change the way I'm approaching it, which might be an appropriate way to mask. And that's on all ends. Like, it's not just the neurodiverse person that needs to mask occasionally. It's also the neurotypical person that needs to say, hold on, I'm getting upset about something that the intent isn't there to upset me. So I need to take a step back and figure this out. You've done a lot of work in the media on being able to shape the portrayal of autistics in the media. And I think that you talked about just understanding a profile, and every single person that I've met that's autistic has a completely different profile, in the same way as everybody who I've met that's not autistic has a completely different profile. How do you make sure that we're not overgeneralizing specific profiles and then treating autistic people in a specific way that maybe is not necessarily healthy for them?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think that you have to question why you do something every time you're doing it. Like, to have that self-awareness, I think is important. I think that's important for everybody. And I think that some of the difficulties that that humanity faces, like just as a race, as all humans on Earth face, is a lack of self-awareness. But a lot of the problems that we're facing is that people haven't thought about, well, what might my impact be, and why might I be thinking that way, or what assumptions am I making? A good example is Bluey. Bluey's a girl, but so many people assumed that Blue was a boy because they're blue, I suppose. I don't know. But it's like things like that. It's like there's a lot of inbuilt assumptions, and like, or assuming that somebody understands the full scope of something. Like I'm someone who's very articulate, and so that's in a way that hides a lot of my difficulty, and it's not like acting, it's not it's just what it is. But people don't realize my vulnerability, and I have learned from experience that I have to put things in place, like if I go to a party and it's in a public place, but I've never been there before, and it might be a bit loose, then I should take someone with me. If I go to a festival, I should take someone with me, and that that person, generally I ask someone who's like sober. When I say sober, what I mean is that they don't drink, or they don't drink a lot, because I don't want to be annoying or stop them from doing what they'd want to do at a festival. But I do need someone, like I think it's fine if they have a couple of pints, they can still keep an eye on me. But if they're gonna like pass out, like I think that's totally fine. We can hang out at a festival, but someone else needs to look after me. Like, I don't need very much. I always describe it as being minded. Like, it's not that I need a carer so much as I need someone that is going to be able to see a problem before I see it. Like things that would seem really obvious, like don't fall asleep in front of an open fire. That seems obvious, but it's not obvious to me because I'm busy thinking about, but I really want to stay awake for the music by the fire.
Yeah.
so I'm very focused on that. So having having people around who like really understand that, I think, is important.
No, I think that the way you describe that is it's the resources, and one of the resources is having those support individuals around you when you know that you're going into challenging times. And you mentioned going into a large party, is that if you have that support, then you can be successful. Then you can kind of have the fun that you were hoping to have at the party. Without that support, I would imagine, is that somebody who's not comfortable in the setting is going to withdraw, or they're not going to be their authentic self, and they're going to try and mask the entire time. And it creates this lack of ability to be a part of the community that you want to be a part of.
Like, I know for myself that I have to manage particularly my auditory stimuli. Now I wear cargo trousers all the time, and one of the reasons is because in my right bottom pocket I have my earplugs, my molded earplugs, and I carry them with me wherever I go. And I have very poor executive functioning, and so if I didn't have full pockets on my trousers, I would lose the things that I need to be carrying with me. But I always carry my earplugs, and it's because I know that I'm sensitive to sound. And so some situations I'll go into a restaurant and I'll just get my earplugs out. Around musicians, that's perfectly normal behavior. But if I go to a restaurant with non-musicians, they're like, what are those things in your ears? I'm like, oh, they're just earplugs. And they're like, how can you hear? And I'm like, no, I can hear you better with them in, because it means I can, everything is turned down and I can just focus on your voice. But I know that about myself as a 38-year-old woman. But when I was like 16, I didn't know that about myself. And so just being able to, like now, I mean, like if I was in a situation and it seemed like it was like I was responding in a way where if things were too loud, maybe Andrew might prompt me to put my earplugs in. But I think I'd probably think of that because it's such a daily occurrence. But that kind of thing, particularly when you're a young adult and you're learning to do things on your own, I think parents need to let their children have the experience of failure, but teach them how. And this should, I think, start from early on. Like as soon as the child's able to think about, okay, what just happened? Why did it happen? What could I have done differently? What didn't work, etc. Like once you're able to do that, you need to be doing that like on a daily basis.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a life skill that we all need, is to be able to learn from our mistakes and to be able to improve our lives based off of those learned failures. But so I mean, we've had a kind of litany of topics, but I mean, it all comes back to similar things: as having those difficult conversations. It's being self-aware. It is creating a supportive environment around yourself to be successful. Where can our listeners go to learn more about the work that you're doing, and also get some more resources on these topics so that we can all be empowered through the journey?
Well, my website, my name is spelt Robyn, Robyn, and my surname is Steward, Steward. So my website's robynsteward.com. And I would also really recommend the work of Michelle Garnett and Tony Attwood. I know that Tony Attwood in the autism community gets a bit of a bad rep because of his sense of humor. But honestly, I think that, like, I don't think he, I've met Tony Attwood and had dinner with him and spent a bit of time with him. And I really think that he has a lot of insights that are really useful to the autism community, and that I think that, I find him quite funny myself, but I also think that his intention isn't to hurt other people's feelings. And obviously, it doesn't take away from if your feelings are hurt by his sense of humor and by the jokes he's making. But I do think that sometimes people maybe judge him too harshly. And I think he has a lot of insights that they're useful, and same with Michelle Garnett. Also, looking at the work of Carol Gray. So I think social stories often end up with a bad rep because they're written badly. And Carol Gray, I think, actually does a vetting service of social stories because she got so fed up with people writing social stories that really weren't social stories, because you could tell whether the person that wrote them liked the child or not. Well, you shouldn't be able to tell that in a social story. So Carol Gray's website, I think, is really good.
Well, I really appreciate your time, Robyn, and then also for sharing both your knowledge set and your experience with us. And I look forward to reading all the material you suggested and being able to follow you going forward.
Great. Well, I'm really happy to have been of use. That's what I'm here for.
Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.